Welcome back to Discourse number 1, the ego personality, the one who miscreates. This is session number 3. Transcendence, from ego consciousness to Christ consciousness. Now that it's been established that there are two thought streams, one being the ego body-mind consciousness and the other Christ consciousness, then it can be helpful to be able to clearly identify the concepts and definitions that each voice speaks of. One voice speaks of truth or primal reality, and the other is the error or delusional reality. The ego body-mind consciousness is the delusional thought of separation. The Christ consciousness is knowledge of truth. So we have fear opposed to love, chaos opposed to order, perception opposed to knowledge, darkness opposed to light, ignorance opposed to truth, separate opposed to whole, conflict opposed to peace, unbalanced opposed to balance, unknowing opposed to knowing, limited opposed to limitless, mortal opposed to immortal, finite opposed to infinite, form or body opposed to formless. As stated in the introduction, evolution is not one of the human being, but one of consciousness. The transcendence of the limited ego body-mind consciousness is seeded with the journey of return to full awareness and awakening to its true identity as an unlimited spiritual being. This pure being, known as Christ consciousness, is in resonance with infinite intelligence and shares the attributes of the mind of all that is. This is at one-ment. In his book, The Gnosis of Kali Yuga, written by spiritual author Aaron G.L. Adoni, he provides a succinct explanation that can assist in this understanding. The ego is the self, but this self is based upon something fundamentally harmful and violent to the rhythm and harmony to the universe as a whole. This is why the ego suffers, and because the consciousness is trapped in the ego, we feel that suffering. The ego is an aberration, an error of the mind that perpetuates itself. It is like a cancer of the mind because it destroys its host. The liberated consciousness with no ego receives and transmits energy, thoughts, ideas, sentiments, will, etc. But the ego takes that perfect harmony and disrupts it. It elaborates itself at the expense of the world around it. So in this way, we have to understand that the ego is what blocks the correct flow of energy. The ego body-mind consciousness is a limitation of the infinite intelligence mind, or all that is. It transduces the all-powerful omniscient mind and minimizes it into a limited, self-centered entity or self that knows not, and hence miscreates and suffers. Once again, the Gnosis of Kali Yuga expands on this understanding. When man becomes a perfect transformer of the intelligence of God, then he has become an incarnation of that intelligence called God. That intelligence or energy that can be called God has no form itself, but it can incarnate with anyone who knows how to do it. However, the ego prevents the correct transformation and transmission of energy because the ego only uses that energy to edify itself. It is like a single wave, thinking it is more than the ocean itself. Thus, the ego prevents the reception of God. The ego body-mind consciousness can therefore be considered a distorted way of thinking that blocks the ability to receive the impulses of infinite intelligence thought stream into conscious awareness. Much like electrical circuits can be limited by the insertion of resistors to reduce current flow from high voltage to low voltage, so too is the ego body-mind consciousness designed to limit the receivership of information emanating from the divine mind. Clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine, Dr. Daniel Siegel, in his book The Developing Mind, provides an excellent definition of what mind may be conceptualized as. The mind is an embodied and rational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Infinite intelligence, as all that is omniscient, meaning all knowledge. So what you are able to receive and know consciously as information is dependent upon the state of mind that you are attuned to. To be inspired in spirit by a new idea or thought is the domain of infinite intelligence, not the limited ego. The idea that the ego body-mind consciousness is limited in its ability to process information or impulses from infinite intelligence can be further clarified by another passage from Siegel's book. We inherit the genetically pre-programmed capacity for information processing of a particular sort. This means that the brain cannot process all types of information. A given module of the mind is only able to handle certain kinds of information in specific kinds of ways. This sentiment of the ego personality being only able to process information in a limited way is acknowledged in the Eastern philosophical teachings. Indian guru Sri Aurobindo, who was one of India's most acknowledged spiritual teachers, wrote many books dealing with the diverse forces that influence our thoughts and impact the ability to receive vital energy from the One. He writes, "It isn't the forces that are limited, it is our receptivity. Each person has a different receptivity. No two receptivities are the same in quality and quantity." Finally, we turn to A Course in Miracles for further clarification. A major source of the ego's off-balance state is its lack of discrimination between the body and the thoughts of God. Thoughts of God are unacceptable to the ego because they clearly point to the non-existence of the ego itself. The ego therefore either distorts them or refuses to accept them. It cannot, however, make them cease to be. It therefore tries to conceal not only unacceptable body impulses, but also the thoughts of God, because both are threatening to it. The fundamental characteristic of the ego body-mind consciousness is that it is a limited expression of consciousness that is restricted in the capacity to receive higher levels of consciousness impulses emanating from the higher mind that is infinite intelligence. This base ego body-mind consciousness begins its journey from a descent into not knowing, which expresses as fear, and ascends to the mind of knowing, which expresses as truth and love. As the Hindu philosophies taught, in order to know, one must first not know. Psychiatrist and consciousness researcher Dr. David R. Hawkins, MD, PhD, wrote numerous books detailing the levels of consciousness that are transcended on the path of spiritual enlightenment. In specific, his book, Transcending Levels of Consciousness, The Stairway to Enlightenment, he provides a roadmap as to the states of being associated with each level of consciousness. From the base we see shame that rises to guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, pride. These are the lower levels of ego consciousness, and then it ascends higher from courage to neutrality to willingness, acceptance, reason, love, unconditional love, joy, peace, enlightenment. To use the analogy of computers, the human body can be considered the hardware of a computer that houses the brain, which is the software or program running. The mind is the processing unit that interfaces between the two and projects onto the screen of life as what you perceive to be your personal reality. The quality of the output on the screen is therefore dependent on the quality of the software or program that is running. Garbage in, garbage out. If there is an error or incorrect information being inputted and processed by the mind, then this may be experienced on your screen of personal reality as painful events in your life which may cause mental suffering. The ego level of consciousness acts like a computer virus, which distorts the source code of primal reality, love, and instead inserts perceptions of false data that appear real and become fearful. When knowledge is absent in the software program, then perceptions replace it. Fear overrides love. A Course in Miracles writes, "Darkness is lack of light, as sin is lack of love. If a mind perceives without love, it perceives an empty shell and is unaware of the spirit within. But the at-one-ment restores spirit to its proper place. The mind that serves spirit is invulnerable." In reference to the above chart mapping the levels of consciousness, the distinction between the fear-based thoughts of the ego, which are lacking in truth, and the higher impulsed Christ consciousness thoughts of love become more obvious. The higher one ascends the ladder of consciousness, the more one comes into balance and harmony with the mind of infinite intelligence, and fear is transformed into its original pure being, which is love. This journey of ascension or transcendence has often been referred to as Jacob's ladder and stairway to heaven. The ego body-mind consciousness is symbolic of states of being that are hell, and the Christ consciousness is pure being that is heaven. As the ego is created to be the opposite or inverted consciousness of the Christ conscious mind, it enables truth to be revealed by knowing and experiencing what is not truth. For the Christ consciousness, it is love. For ego body-mind consciousness experience, it is unloved. Knowing is unknowing. Aware, unaware, unconscious. True, untrue. Forgiveness, unforgiving. Certain, uncertain. Satisfied and fulfilled, unsatisfied, unfulfilled. Connected, unconnected. Just, unjust. Peace, unpeaceful. Real, unreal. The divine paradox, the one is all and the all is one. In primal reality, where all that is known as truth, then the ego is created as the paradoxical opposite where truth is veiled or ignored. The law of unity, light, interacts with the law of division and separation, darkness. This is the paradox of the creative universe, diversity contained within unity. A Course in Miracles. For this world is the opposite of heaven, being made to be its opposite, and everything here takes a direction exactly opposite of what is true. In heaven, where the meaning of love is known, love is the same as union. Here, where the illusion of love is accepted in love's place, love is perceived as separation and exclusion. Your Christ consciousness carries the remembrance of your true identity and essential nature as a spiritual being or awareness. This is your natural, organic state of being. The ego body-mind consciousness is a synthetic or artificial construct that is created as an idea that it is possible to be separate and apart from the one, absolute, omniscient, and omnipotent mind of God. English philosopher Rupert Spira provides an enlightened perspective in one of his lectures, The True Goal of Life. The purpose of life is to find happiness. God is just a religious name for happiness. Happiness is the knowingness of our own being as it is. When we overlook the knowingness of our own being, we obscure the true nature of I. That is why the separate self is always unhappy, always seeking happiness, because the separate self is a limitation on our essential nature. With this veiling of our consciousness, the truth of our true nature is lost, so there is this longing to return. This concept that the ego, body, mind, consciousness is an idea expressed in the mind of infinite intelligence, or all that is crucial understanding on the journey of enlightenment. If the ego is a synthetic or artificially created entity that is not your natural state of being, then it must have been created to have an experience in opposition to primal reality. To experience separation, you must have a thought that thinks, I am separate. This is the role that the ego, body, mind, consciousness thought stream serves. It pretends, like an actor, that it is someone else or a character in a play that is playing a role and experiencing something other than who it really is. The ego thought takes the impersonal, infinite intelligence thought of the all and makes it personal. What is all, whole and unified, now becomes me, separate disunity. A key passage in chapter 27 of A Course in Miracles states, "Into eternity where all is one, there crept a tiny mad idea, at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh. In his forgetting did the thought become a serious idea, possible of both accomplishment and real effects." The etymology dictionary defines idea as archetype, concept of a thing in the mind of God. From this definition of idea, you now have a link to the spiritual concept of archetypes, which appear frequently in spiritual literature. The ego is an archetype. The definition of archetype in the etymology dictionary states model, first form, original pattern from which copies are made. If we combine these two definitions, then the ego can be described as an idea, which is an archetype or pattern of information. If primal reality is the realm of infinite intelligence and all that is, which is invisible to our senses, then the ego archetype is the pattern of thought that creates perception or something to see or be perceivable. The original error or sin of guilt is suppressed into the unconscious, the unseen, which is then projected. It is projection that creates perception. This is how you have made the invisible visible, as an illusion, hallucination, or a dream. Without the ego's limited consciousness, there would be no perception or nothing to see and experience. All is light. The ego is the shadow or darkness that blinds you to the light and ignores the primal reality that exists behind everything. When you have been caught in a world of perception, you have been caught in a dream. You cannot escape without help, because everything your senses show merely witness to the reality of the dream. Spiritual author Neale Donald Walsch, in his book Communion with God, provides an excellent commentary of this concept of the ego being an idea of separation in the mind of infinite intelligence, or God. The experience of your life beginning and ending is really nothing more than the onset and dissolution of your idea of yourself as separate. At a conscious level, you may not know this. At a higher level, this is always clear. It is at this higher level that you seek to end the experience of separation, to remind yourself that this is an illusion that you have created. A question may naturally arise at this time, if you have understood this concept being introduced, that infinite intelligence, or all that is, creates the idea of separation that your ego, body, mind, consciousness experiences as an illusion. That question is, why? Again, Neale Donald Walsch provides valuable insight. If everything is experienced as unified, then nothing can be experienced as unified, because unity does not exist as a discrete experience. It is not something that can be known. It may exist as a concept, but it is not a concept that you can directly experience. It can only be an idea, never your experienced reality. Yet it is our wish to know ourselves as who we really are. Thus, we must first create the experience of who we are not. Since we cannot create this experience in ultimate reality, we must do so through illusion. We are the collective, the single reality in multiple form, having taken multiple form that we might notice and experience the glory of our single reality. This sentiment of the whole dividing itself to experience the idea of disunity is also a primary concept behind the Eastern philosophical teachings. In his book Autobiography of a Yogi, The Law of Miracles, Eastern Guru Paramahansa Yogananda writes, "The ancient Vedic scriptures declare that the physical world operates under one fundamental law of Maya, the principle of relativity and duality. God, the soul life, is an absolute unity. He cannot appear as the separate and diverse manifestations of a creation except under a false or unreal veil. That cosmic illusion is Maya. Every great scientific discovery of modern times has served as a confirmation of this simple pronouncement of the rishis. The ego archetype, the deception of separation. If you accept that the ego body-mind consciousness is an artificially constructed mind that limits or veils the truth of primal reality, then the ego's personal reality that creates through projection and perception must also be artificially created or unreal. This is the Maya, dream, illusion, cosmic dream or Lila that is so often referred to in spiritual literature. To further understand the role of the archetype as the actor in this cosmic dream, then you must first be familiar with the concept of polarity, which is also one of the natural laws along with the previous two mentioned earlier in this discourse. This is because the ego archetype is an electromagnetic construct that determines the patterns of vibrations that become the signature of your personal subjective identity known as I, or the me in the play of your life. The principle of polarity. All manifested things have two sides, two aspects, two poles, a pair of opposites, which manifold degrees between two extremes. All is degree, a matter of higher or lower vibrations. If we return to our former analogy of computers that was mentioned earlier, where the body is like the hardware of a computer, the brain is the software, and the mind is the interface between the two, then the computer language used in this process is binary. So too does the ego archetype use the same language of binary, which is energy polarized as two, electromagnetic. This is the basis of the ego's personal reality of duality, where the one, unity, experiences duality, two. The symbols mentioned earlier as the tree of life, unity, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, duality, represent this idea. Christ consciousness is not divided or dual, it is one. This is light. Binary code allows for the one to appear to be divided into two, light and darkness, energy on, energy limited. The processing unit of mind is consciousness measuring or observing this expression of light and dark and displaying that judgment upon the illusory screen that you experience as personal reality. Now there is the capacity for opposites or other to be experienced instead of only unity or oneness. The absolute reality of all that is can experience relativity or this or that, not just that. The Eastern philosophy shared this same insight and understanding and used the symbol of the yin and yang to express this concept of opposites. Every aspect of the ego's reality is created from this binary code that allows the experience of opposites. What is in balance now has the capacity to be out of balance, or change occurs from this place. Neither of the poles are superior to the other, and an increase in one brings a corresponding decrease in the other. A correct balance between the two poles, or opposites, must be reached in order to achieve harmony, which is whole. Fritjof Capra, an American physicist, researched the similarities between the Eastern philosophical teachings and the science of quantum physics that explored the deep nature of reality. In his book, The Tao of Physics, he writes, "Opposites are abstract concepts belonging to the realm of thought, and as such they are relative. By the very act of focusing our attention on any one concept, we create its opposite. As Lao Tzu says, when all in the world understand beauty to be beautiful, then ugliness exists. When all understand goodness to be good, then evil exists." Mystics transcend this realm of intellectual concepts, and in transcending it become aware of the relativity and polar relationship of all opposites. They realize that good and bad, pleasure and pain, life and death are not absolute experiences belonging to different categories, but are merely two sides of the same reality, extreme parts of a single whole. With this expanded understanding of polarities and duality, we can now return to the concept of the ego as an archetype that overlays the absolute primal reality and limits awareness into patterns of specific fixations of focus and attention. The archetype will determine what you pay attention to by applying filters and biases that allow information to be made conscious or be suppressed in the unconscious. The archetype becomes the veil of ignorance mentioned previously, a paradox of opposites where truth is overlaid with a lie or deception, an untruth. The word ignorance derives from the Latin term ignore, meaning not to know, be unacquainted, take no notice, disregard. What is known now can become unknown by ignoring or not paying attention to its ever-present existence. This state of knowing or ignoring truth causes fear within the human entity that is seated with the archetypical veil that filters truth out of its awareness. The Christ consciousness is the whole mind at one with life. It is in balance, harmony, and equilibrium. Ego body-mind consciousness is seated with the archetype that is polarized and hence experiences duality that expresses as imbalance, out of harmony and in resistance to life, but always seeking to regain it, as that is the law of one that compels the universe into existence. The ego then is a personality disorder that experiences fear, neurosis, psychosis, multiple personalities and fantasies, an insane thought system that now has conditions placed on its experience to relieve the cognitive dissonance experienced in its split mind. A Course in Miracles writes, "The ego is quite literally a fearful thought. However ridiculous the idea of attacking God may be to the sane mind, never forget that the ego is not sane. It represents a delusional system and speaks for it." Previously in this discourse, the symbology of the biblical story of the Garden of Eden was referred to in explaining the tree of knowledge of good and evil as the beginning of the existence of duality. With this arising of duality into experience, the ego body-mind consciousness becomes polarized with temptations where thoughts are judgments. Concepts such as good and bad, right and wrong, pain and pleasure can be entertained by the limited mind, and each degree is polarized with either a positive or negative electromagnetic charge. This is significant as this relative mode of thinking in opposites or being binary only allows one expression of judgment into conscious awareness. The opposite is suppressed. This mode of judgmental or polarized thought is expressed as your individuated personal identity that divides reality and then behaves in a very particular way to express that judgment. These become the levels of consciousness or states of being that was explained earlier in David R. Hawkins' chart detailing the hierarchical levels of consciousness being transcended. Author Ken Wilber, in his book The Spectrum of Consciousness, assists in further explaining how this suppression of the opposite, fundamental to the ego's thought processes based on separation and division, continually arise in the levels of consciousness that Hawkins charted. He writes, "Thus each dualism is accompanied by a repression and a projection. A dualism severs a process, represses its non-duality or unitary character, and projects that process as two apparently antagonistic opposites. This general process of dualism, repression, projection is an important one, for it repeats itself numerous times throughout all subsequent levels of consciousness, each time generating a new band of the spectrum and increasing man's ignorance of his supreme identity." The levels or spectrums of consciousness that both Hawkins and Wilber discuss in their books are essentially describing the nature of personality types expressed by the ego archetypes. In Western psychology, ego archetypes can be identified within such reports as the Myers-Briggs Personality Types Index. In spiritual studies, they are identified as enneagrams. Essentially, there are identifiable and repeatable patterns of thoughts exhibiting behavioral characteristics that can be associated with the binary, dualistic nature of the ego-body-mind consciousness spectrum, thus creating the subjective experience of I, or me, and other. In Eastern philosophies, the Chinese also had a symbolic representation of archetypical patterns that were detailed in the I Ching, or Book of Changes. Much like the binary code mentioned earlier, the I Ching uses the principle of yin and yang and their interplay of the polar opposites as the ordering principle behind the cosmic drama or dream. The solid line represented the yang energy, or positive, and broken lines represented yin energy, or negative. When yin and yang energy is combined into 8 configurations known as trigrams, they were considered to represent all possible cosmic and human scenarios or situations. This was the fundamental pattern underlying transformation and change that was implicit in the universe or cosmos. The I Ching virtually maps the various binary configurations where the whole can be divided in various proportions to experience imbalance. The ego archetype distortion of the whole expresses opposites as a personality disorder and miscreates its experiences as a reflection of that imbalanced relationship. This is the script underlying all the human dramas. Again, Ken Wilber further explains, "Thus, in the ultimate act of severance and fragmentation, man imposes a dualism or split upon his own ego, represses the underlying unity of all his egoic tendencies, and projects them as the persona versus the shadow. It is the nature of every dualism, repression, projection, that it presents an apparent or illusory reality, that it reveals things as they seem to be and not as they are. Although the individual represses and projects certain facets of himself, those facets nevertheless remain his and only appear to exist in the environment. So when man tries to disown facets of himself, since they remain his, they only boomerang and return to plague him in the form of neurotic symptoms." The state of suffering experienced by the ego is an expression of this underlying imbalance that is seated within the ego archetype. As the underlying principle of primal reality and truth is balance and equilibrium, there is an urge contained within life itself to always compel a return to this pure being. This is known as peace. As long as the ego body mind consciousness remains a split identity or imbalance with an unintegrated shadow complex repressed in the unconscious, then peace becomes impossible. Internal conflict will prevail and be experienced as suffering. A Course in Miracles affirms this claim that the illusion of separation is created by the ego's psychological repression and projection. The separated mind cannot maintain a separation except by dissociating. Having done this, it utilizes repression against all truly natural impulses, not because the ego is a separate thing, but because you want to believe that you are. The ego is a device for maintaining this belief, but it is still only your willingness to use the device that enables it to endure. As you cultivate a deeper level of understanding by delving further into this concept that the ego body mind consciousness projects the shadow complex out into its environment, then such terms as evil become clearer. Much confusion has surrounded the human entity when contemplating why God seems to allow atrocities and acts of cruelty to be inflicted in human affairs. When you are able to reconcile the truth that the ego, by the act of repression and projection, perceives an illusory, unreal world created by a split mind, you will then understand that evil is not an act of God, but an action of an imbalanced, insane ego thought system that is at war with itself. God is not a perception, as this is unreal, illusory state of being. Only the ego perceives, because perception is the veil to truth. Again, A Course in Miracles makes this clear. The ego is a contradiction. Man's self and God's self are in opposition. They are opposed in creation, in will and in outcome. They are fundamentally irreconcilable because the soul cannot perceive and the ego cannot know. They are therefore not in communication and can never be in communication. Concepts such as good and evil, right and wrong, love and hate are only judgments of an ego body mind consciousness that is out of balance. They are not intrinsic to truth or primal reality. Acts of evil are therefore possible experiences capable of expression by all ego archetypes when placed in the circumstances that allow for it to surface out of the depths of the unconscious. Earlier in this discourse, the ego body mind consciousness was defined as an inverted or opposite consciousness to Christ consciousness, referred to as Antichrist. This label may appear to be confronting, as it implies some form of representation of satanic or devil associations. This is not the case in truth, as it is only a term used to define the imbalanced state of the ego that is the opposite to Christ consciousness, and hence capable of experiencing conditioned behaviors that can be labeled good and evil. The Book of Revelation also provides clarification of this position. Here is wisdom. Let him that have understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. In the Kabbalistic traditions, the use of gematria was used as a tool to interpret biblical texts. It forms the basis of numerology and assigns letters of the Hebrew alphabet with numbers. The word chi in Hebrew means life, alive, or living, and is assigned the number 18. The number 18, when added again, becomes the number 9, which is the unity of that expression. It is an established law that every unity contains within itself this trinity of spirit as the number 3. Hence it is written 333, equaling 9. The physical human entity in duality, and therefore a divided entity, consists of one and another. Each according to the law is 666, which is deemed the number of the beast. Spiritual author Thomas Troward provides further explanation provided within his book, The Hidden Powers. Why of the beast? Because the separateness from God, or the duality of opposition, which is also a duality of polarity, which is dual unity, recognizes something as having essential being, which is not the one spirit, and such a conception can be verbally rendered only by some word that in common acceptance represents something, not only lower than the divine, but lower than the human also. The purpose of life is to be whole. To be whole is to be integrated, where body, soul, and spirit are harmonized and in equilibrium. This is where the spiritual essence is aligned with the human entity, and all that is can be expressed and experienced more fully as your highest potential, where thy will be done replaces my will be done. Evil, when spelled backwards or inverted, is live. So evil is a state in opposition to life. The word devil, which is often associated with evil, derives from the Latin word diabolus, meaning powerful spirit of evil, otherwise known as Satan. Satan in Hebrew means adversary, one who plots against another. Every ego archetype must therefore have an adversary or beast built into that psyche that must be integrated before wholeness can be experienced. Ignoring or denying your own dark side will not be an option for you when undertaking the path of spiritual enlightenment. In his book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, psychologist Eric Newman writes, "To be obliged to admit that one is infantile and maladjusted, miserable and ugly, a human animal related to the monkeys, a sexual beast and a creature of the herd, is in itself a shattering experience for any ego that has identified itself with the collected values. But the roots of the shadow problem goes deeper still, and it becomes a matter of deadly earnest when the probe reaches right down to the sources of evil itself, where the personality experiences its relationship with the enemy of mankind, the drive to aggression and destruction, in the structure of its own being." Julius Caesar once said, "The greatest enemy will hide in the last place you ever look." This concept of integrating the evil or beast within our own psyche is such a crucial understanding that it will be further examined in depth in the discourse entitled The Underworld. This concludes session number 3 for Discourse 1, the ego personality, the one who miscreates. I invite you to attend session 4. I shall put a link in the description box below. Thank you so much for your attendance for this session. I'll see you in session 4. So be it.